Welcome to this third session. In this session, we will discuss the topic of samples. We will talk about samples and different types of sampling, before we go into more detail about quality criteria. And finally, we will talk about data. This video gives insights into the topic of quantitative sampling. To understand what a sample is, it makes sense to distinguish it from the population. Population is the total number of statistical units. This means it comprises all relevant units of investigation that can be investigated in principle, whether defined geographically, temporally, or objectively. For example, if you conduct a scientific study in Switzerland, the population could include the whole of Switzerland, that is, all 8 million people living in Switzerland. The sample, on the other hand, refers to a subset of the population that has been selected for specific reasons. As we will see later, there are different types of samples and sampling, which have to meet different requirements. The term sample originally comes from the field of iron processing, and at that time referred to tapping at the blast furnace to take a sample of the liquid metal. A special case of sample is the representative sample, which exactly reflects the population. For example, if you intend to make a statement about Swiss citizens that is as general as possible, it makes sense to draw a representative sample. And in so doing, you should define some characteristics by which you want to ensure representativeness. For example, it may make sense to aim for exactly the same gender ratio in your sample as in the population. The same could apply, for example, to the age structure, the level of education, and the ratio of language regions. If these points are taken into account, one can make a relatively precise statement with a relatively manageable sample size of perhaps 1,000 respondents. For example, about the attitudes and behavior of the population, or in this case, of all 8 million Swiss people. This is shown graphically here once again. We take a sample from the population, carry out the scientific investigation on the basis of this sample, and based on the results of the investigation, we draw conclusions about the population. As we will see in sessions 5 and 6, inference statistics will help us here. Samples can be divided into two broad categories, according to the way the respondents are selected. One is non-random sampling, and the other is random sampling, also called probability sampling. In turn, probability samples can be divided into 4 subcategories. The first is simple random sampling, possibly the most common selection method. In simple random sampling, each unit of the population is included in the sample with the same probability. The systematic random sample is a variation of the simple random sample. It involves selecting a random starting point, and then, after a fixed sampling interval, selecting additional units. An example of this would be if every 10th vehicle is systematically checked during a vehicle inspection. In stratified random sampling, all units of the population are divided into distinct strata. These strata are divided up on the basis of a common characteristic relevant to the issue at hand. Subsequently, partial samples are taken at random from each stratum. In a vehicle inspection, for example, the vehicles could be divided into different vehicle types, such as cars, trucks, and bicycles. Random samples are then taken from each of these categories. In the case of cluster sampling, the population is first broken down into subpopulations, known as clusters. A part of these clusters is randomly selected for the study. In a multi-stage procedure, samples are again taken within the clusters. Imagine that a national survey is conducted. In a cluster sample, for example, individual municipalities or districts could be selected within which all individuals are surveyed.